Idea. Comments, right? But you put Aries after them. Why don't we do that? Context. In 1419, a judge was thrown out of a window and he fucking died. Then, in 2021, the YouTuber Copycat, that's his username, there's not a vigilante out there who copies YouTubers as his MO, uploaded a video titled Why Each Nintendo Franchise Triggers You, then renamed to The Worst Thing About Every Nintendo Franchise, where he talked about his favorite movies or whatever. Former commentator Keyblade Master ended up commentating on that video. Non-former commentator DM Commentator commentated on that, and non-former commentator Nina commentated on that. These are the degrees, this is my avatar, and this is a picture of a flower. Let's begin. Actually, let's not begin. Hi, editing in logic here. In the process of me making this video, I encountered some computer problems that led to this video being delayed. I lost a bunch of files, including the source videos for this commentary. I was able to re-download almost all of them, with the exception of Keyblade's video, because the re-upload I got it from was taken down at some point. For the sake of visual consistency, I planned on using it for his segment so that, in case there was a visual edit or one was covered through several interjections, the only one was worth covering, I'd use it to go directly to the point. But now that the video is lost, whenever there was a segment from his video I wanted to include in full, I had to recreate the source by stitching Ephraim and Nina's context together. I tried to make it as seamless as possible, but if you notice any weird cuts whenever Key speaks, that's why. This also means that I had to remove a few interjections that were aimed at Key because they were just not on either of the following degrees. Another thing. As I was editing this video, I went to grab a screenshot of Ephraim's channel for the introduction and I found out that, 4 days before I wrote this post point, he uploaded a commentary on the very video I'll be covering. I won't watch it during the making of this, but it wouldn't surprise me if there is some overlap in our points. Hopefully not, but if there is any, sorry, I didn't know.
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
On September 3, 2021, a countdown maker by the name of Copycat released a video titled, The Worst Thing About Every Nintendo Franchise, where he would talk about what he thought to be the worst things about every Nintendo franchise. Well, not every single franchise. I guess Chibi Robo, Custom Robo and Golden Sun and the rest of the franchises listed here are perfect in his eyes.
I'm just going to point out that all of the franchises that Copycat brings up, save for arguably Luigi's Mansion, are included in this collection of excluded franchises that Nina shows on screen. Not a big deal, just thought it was worth mentioning. There's nothing really wrong with the rest of the introduction or the first few interjections, but I do want to show you guys something that will be important later and is also just great.
I want to open by talking about his title, Nitpicks Are Complaints Now, which, yeah, they are. Nitpicks, by definition, are valid criticisms over things that don't actually matter in the grand scheme of the product.
Quick question, where did you get the idea that nitpicks are, quote-unquote, inherently valid? I ask you that because I was looking up the definition of nitpick, and nowhere in my search did I find a definition that said that nitpicks are inherently valid. The definition of nitpicking describes it as giving too much attention to details that are not important, so unless I'm missing something then wherever you found this definition of nitpick is faulty. And if by off chance this was self-made, then it wasn't well thought out since it makes nitpicks seem like they're always correct when nitpicks can still be criticized if the information surrounding them is faulty.
I just want to bring attention to the fact that Ephraim's first point is about nitpicks and Nina's response is to nitpick the wording Ephraim used. This is not a complaint by the way, the actual argument is valid. I just found it really funny. Also, again, this will be important later, so have it at the back of your mind.
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
I decided to check out Copycat's channel, where I found this video, and the moment I saw this tasteless title, I knew a commentary was in order.
Quick question, how is the title tasteless exactly?
How would they not be? You're not supposed to... Ephraim, have you been getting video titles? Are you okay? Do we need to call an ambulance?
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
From time to time, they have definitely had some missteps. Whether it be a lack of story, terrible levels, or the entries being way too easy.
Okay, first off, saying Animal Crossing has a lack of a story is really funny, considering within the most recent installment, there is technically a small story there via building up your island and its ratings until KK Slider shows up.
Ignoring how a small story doesn't do anything to Copycat's point about the lack of story in the Animal Crossing series, the worst thing about the Animal Crossing series for him isn't even the lack of the story.
Why does that matter? He never said that it was the worst part of Animal Crossing in Copycat's eyes. He just argued against a complaint that Copycat brought up. Now, you could argue that the words did not meet in Copycat's complaint for Key to make a satisfying rejection against it, and I could maybe see your point, but Copycat made a factual statement about the game and Key tried to argue that that statement was incorrect. Now, in practice there are problems with what Key presented which both you and Ephraim bring up, but those will be problems with the execution. There's nothing inherently wrong with Key trying to debunk what Copycat said.
Lack of story isn't big enough of a problem to have its segment, nor is this the central point he's making. What the hell, Key?
I know I said that there was no problem with the nitpick that Nina made towards Ephraim, but here represents a problem for her. If Key shouldn't argue against Copycat's point about story in Animal Crossing because the real point he makes is about repetitiveness, then why did you get to argue about Ephraim calling nitpicks valid, when the real point he was making was that nitpicks are complaints and that was a problem with the title for Key's video? Maybe you could argue that since Ephraim was trying to build a definition, there is more room to argue about specific wording, but I still feel like this is something worth bringing up since you are getting on his case for trying to debunk a statement in a commentary.
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
And secondly, this outline doesn't do a good job on giving the audience a good understanding of this list, since from the way you structure this part and your very tasteless title for this video, it makes this video come off as if you're pointing out the objective worst things about these franchises.
What? What? I don't get you. What about his presentation so far has made you think this was some kind of objective list?
Perhaps there are 3 reasons why Key feels this way. A. Copycat never stated that he would be subjective on his list. While yes, you don't always have to state that a list will be subjective, if other factors make the list seem objective, it would be best to state that it'll be subjective to not cause any confusion here.
This is wrong for several reasons. Thanks for watching, don't remember to like and subscribe. In all seriousness, what factors could make this list look objective? It's not just me asking that question as an introduction to a debunking, I seriously can't think of any. Frame rates and frame drops? I guess, but that would depend on whether or not the people mind that during their gameplay, which would make it subjective. Sales? That would depend on people knowing the game's budget, and even then it would depend on expectations. If one person expected the game to make 3 times as much money as was spent on it, and it made 4 times the budget, then it would be a success, but if another expected it to make 6 times the budget, then it would be a failure. This would also be subjective. I can't even think of a third hypothetical factor to round it out, I'm seriously at a loss here. Maybe you meant that the following B and C would be the factors, but then why list them as separate things? And also, you just have to explain how those factors appear in the video, and how they lead to the video seeming to try for objectivity.
B. He straight up said that there are quote-unquote serious flaws that he wanted to discuss, meaning Copycat's saying that there are serious flaws in Nintendo games that need to be fixed or addressed.
Wouldn't that make it clear that it is a subjective list? Flaws, even if they are serious, are still subjective. Just because some people view something as an unforgivable flaw, it doesn't mean that others inherently do so. I'm an example of this. One of the biggest complaints thrown at Chocolat and thrown on X-Men is about the storyline known as Draco, mainly about how it treats the character of Nightcrawler and what it adds to his backstory. The story then reveals that the character Nightcrawler is the son of a new villain named Azazel. There are 2 reasons why people dislike this reveal. One, it was originally planned that Nightcrawler would have been the child of the villain Mystique, and her, at the time, definitely 100% bestie and now wife, Destiny, who was never given the green light due to the homophobia of the era. The second and most important reason is that they view it as ruining the core of who Nightcrawler is as a character and, most clearly, ruined his original introduction in Giant Size X-Men. But that shows him being chased down by a bunch of villagers with fire and pitchforks, trying to kill him because they believe him to be a demon, and Azazel is said to have lived for thousands of years and inspired the look that's commonly associated with demons. From many people's point of view, this ruins Nightcrawler's introduction as it makes the villagers in the right, as that ancestry makes Nightcrawler a demon. I disagree with both of these reasons. For the first one, I don't think it's fair for one writer to be blamed for not taking into account something that neither the person who came up with the idea or anyone else that followed included. For the second, I think it's the complete misunderstanding of Nightcrawler's debut, as, in its core, it's about someone being judged by his physical and genetic characteristics rather than his person. Whether or not Nightcrawler is a demon, it doesn't matter, it's getting to the same conclusion, just taking a different path. A lot of people consider what I describe as a vital mistake for Austin's run on X-Men, one of the first things that are brought up when talking about its negatives. And yet I disagree with that notion because these things are subjective.
And C. The title of Copycat's video, but more on that later. And by later, I mean my next interjection.
Even looking at the title you showed, what triggers people, either in the psychological context or the internet discussion context, is subjective and is going to vary from person to person. Again, unless there's something I'm missing, in which case, well, you can guess what the issue is.
In what way is the title subjective? It's written in a third-person sort of way of why each Nintendo franchise upsets you, not things about each Nintendo franchise that bugs me, or anything else that would imply that it's his opinion. Instead, it's a title that suggests it's an objective list. Something even Copycat caught on to while Key's commentary was being made. He changed the title to the title he put on the thumbnail, showing us that even he found the title to be a problem worth changing.
I fail to see how this new title does anything but make the list more objective. The original title literally features a subject, you, referring to a specific person or group of people, while the worst thing about every Nintendo game leaves out any possible person out of the discussion while using a definitive. At least with the original title, you could come up with the excuse that the you is a roommate, a sibling, or that someone else uploaded the video and that the you is copycat. With the new one, they are straight up calling the things they bring up A, flaws, and B, the worst of them. If anything is more subjective, it's the former. Also, if we follow your logic and assume that the new title makes the video seem more subjective, and the new title is just the text from the thumbnail, wouldn't that just mean that the thumbnail was already making note that the video was subjective? Why even bother then?
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
Starting things off with Nintendo's first franchise they debuted on the NES in 1985, Mario. Where I'd have to say that the worst thing about this series of games is that when they do include a multiplayer mode, it almost always is underwhelming. Even though it's a vital focus of games like Super Mario 3D World and the new Super Mario Bros. Console entries, it always felt cumbersome to have 4 separate characters on screen at one time, as it forces players to stay together rather than explore on their own.
So you find it cumbersome for the players to stick together as opposed to exploring on their own. Despite the fact that in the new Super Mario Bros. Games, the levels are very straightforward, with the level design being a straight line due to those games being 2D.
So, just because a game is linear and two-dimensional, that doesn't mean the game is unable to have explorative aspects. The classic Sonic series, for example, are linear games, but the games do reward you for stopping and exploring your surroundings. Sonic 3 Ampersand Knuckles, for example, has giant rings hidden throughout the level, which will take you to special stages where you can earn the Chaos and later Super Emerald, which, I should note, you need to do if you want to get the best ending in the game. Hell, the picture of New Super Mario Bros. Wii that you put on screen is from level 1-3, which has a secret exit that, if gotten, will take the player to a warp cannon where they can skip to World 5. That is a perfect example of encouraging exploration in an otherwise linear game. Oh, and by the way, warp zones are something the Mario series has been doing since literally their first game on the NES. Just wanted to remind everyone.
Okay, before I go on to explain the rest of the point, I'd like to thank Jack Lockstyle for pointing out something about the Sonic example Ephraim used. His issue carries over to the next point about warp zones, which is why I included his comment here. The comparison from Sonic's special stage rings from Sonic 3 and Knuckles to those warp zones in New Super Mario Bros. Is faulty. The latter is used to skip segments of the game to a certain worlds, whereas the former, after you use them, keeps you in the same spot of the level. The warp zones are optional, but they function completely differently progression-wise. Also, those special stages are used to get the good ending, yes, but some to most players are only just wanting to complete the levels normally. It's not so much as a reward, and more so a necessity to get that ending, which I do not think those warp zones in Mario are needed for a certain criteria for completion, but details.
The distinction between the Super Emerald and Warp Zone example confuses me. You bring out that you are locked out of getting the true ending if you don't collect the Super Emerald in Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Not that you are forbidden from getting any ending otherwise. Do the true ending. Is that not a reward for exploration? I'm assuming that it's not being seen this way because the reward is something that is desired by most players, in this case beating the game fully, which would then lead to the question, just how desirable the rewards have to be before it stops being seen as a reward and starts being seen as a requirement. Even then, doesn't getting the Chaos and or Super Emeralds reward Sonic with a transformation that makes the game easier for the player? Just through eyeing the maps, I've been able to find 7 different challenging locations. I'm not going to show all of them because again, 70. Even if you view getting the true ending as an obligation, exploration still benefits you as you can get the perks earlier. Sure, that's not the same as straight up skipping levels, but it does help in trimming the fat now. You could argue that they're similar in that respect. Or, the other question brings up, why are we focusing on what the reward specifically is, when Ephraim's point is that exploration is very much possible on 2D games, to the point that some of the early games of the genre offer rewards for it.
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
More recently in Super Mario Odyssey and in Bowser's Fury, the co-op has involved the second player controlling the game's ancillary characters, like Happy and Bowser Jr., only helping the first player by collecting items and easily defeating enemies. Although this method of co-op works on some levels, especially if you're playing with a person that's new to video games, it does however make your experience incredibly easy, taking any risk away that makes the playthrough more rewarding.
Takes away any risk how exactly? Considering unlike in the previous games you talked about, the second player here really can't do much aside from finding secrets with their specific ability, collecting coins, or taking out enemies. Stuff that, while helpful to the first player, isn't exactly game-breaking, thus leaving room for challenge. Especially when said challenge in Mario games comes from the platforming and obstacles.
Obstacles that the second player has the ability to remove. Do you know what an obstacle is exactly? It's just something that gets in the way of progress. The enemies in Mario games being an example of this. If the second player can take out enemies, they have the ability to remove obstacles by definition.
Except that the word obstacles can have different definitions. For instance, it can be used to refer to level design, traps, such as spike pillars and thwomps, time limits, and many other things. Things that the second player is unable to control.
Enemies are not the only kinds of obstacles you can have, sure, but they are still a large portion of them. Giving a second player the ability to remove, just to throw a number out there, a fourth of all the level's obstacles undoubtedly makes navigating through it easier, which was Copycat's point. The alternative to enemies as obstacles don't do much for me either. The first problem would be that level design is an obstacle when more accurately obstacles approach the level design, as any addition to a level would be part of its design. But that's more of a wording problem that isn't really that important. It's your examples that really bother me. I can agree with you on the time limit bit, that's fine. Your traps? Mostly. Thwomps are enemies for one. You can kill them with giant mushrooms and stars. And I could sort of agree on spikes, but he did make the effort to differentiate between platforming and obstacles, so one could argue that avoiding spikes is a form of platforming.
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
The next franchise we're going to look at in this video is the turn-based style Fire Emblem series.
Tread very lightly or you'll be coming out of this segment in pieces!
Why? If he did something wrong, are you going to challenge him to, And that, ladies and gentlemen, is most of what I know about Yu-Gi-Oh!
And although I haven't played many of its games, when I have, the worst part about them has to be the fog of war levels. What this means is that you have a limited vision of the map, making it impossible to properly predict where to go, and ensuring that you're going to fail several times like I always would. What I hated the most about these levels was the AI, as they are incredibly unpredictable, so there would be playthroughs where you need to guide someone from point A to point B, and they die before you even reach them.
Not gonna lie, you had me at the first part. Since yes, not being able to see where you go is a problem with these fog of war maps, granted, there are workarounds to getting better vision in these maps like torches and in some games spells that increase visibility, but that wouldn't negate how this is still an issue.
Okay, full disclosure, I know basically nothing about Fire Emblem, so maybe this interjection would make more sense if I did, but I'm not even entirely sure what he's going for. So we'll ignore the fact that you began this interjection by threatening to treat your commentary target like the looting it started. That's just being thrown to the wayside now. You've changed your mind on that, I guess.
Wait, so you bring up that Key was joking with the whole threat thing? Only to dismiss it in this interjection and act as if he was serious here. I guess Livy is not the only one who hates John's capitalism. Honestly, I'm more confused about how this joke was poor, since the root of the joke is him making a threat that if Copycat said something wrong about Fire Emblem then he would shoot him. After Copycat explains his point, Key would respond properly. Copycat had something going for his segment but squandered it, so I don't see how this joke was too confusing.
I can see where the notion that Ephraim believing Key was serious would come from, but I disagree about it being the case. I don't know Ephraim, but I think it's a safe bet that if he were to witness an actual serious death threat directed towards someone, he would not, in order, joke alongside it, say that he doesn't play Fire Emblem, make a reference and instead bring it up before ignoring it completely in favor of arguing video games. Sure, he did use the word threat, but what Key did was a threat. A joke threat, sure, but it wouldn't be wrong to call it a threat. Especially when he played along with the joke prior. His audience would already know that Key was joking. He doesn't need to clarify that again. Maybe Ephraim did mean for it to come off as if he thought Key was serious. I can't read his mind. Yet, I'm still working on that. But isn't it more likely that he was referring to the contrast between, "Oh, you're going to make me so mad I'll kill you too"? Well, I actually agree quite a bit with what you said, good sir. That's what I got from it at least. The problem with the joke would not come from him misunderstanding the joke, but more from the response that followed not reaching the expectation that was set up by the joke. Also, I know that Key wasn't actually agreeing with Copycat, but Ephraim proceeds to argue as if he were, so, from his understanding, that's what happened. Also, Key, I get that you want to bring up ways to ease the problems that Fog of War brings, but I don't get why you chose to bring up the torch item and torch staffs, but not thieves, who usually have a longer range of sight compared to other classes. Maybe the reasoning was that the footage showed disadvantage that thieves have? But if that's the case, you bring up the torch item, but not the fact that the light caused by it and the one caused by the thief class stack? That would be a really useful bit of info to give out if someone were to struggle on these maps.
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
Key, I'm not a fan of your point about torches and visibility spells since looking through the wiki. The only place you can buy torch staff in Fire Emblem 7 is through a secret shop and not everyone will find the shop, same with torches.
True, you can only buy torch staves in these stores, but that's not the only way of obtaining them. In Chapter 18, there's a thief that will drop this staff when defeated. Granted, if the thief's movement is not stopped or altered, he will leave them up by turn 4, but he's still close enough for the player to easily access. For clarification, for this interjection I will be numbering the chapters in the game as if they were being played in Elwood mode and not Hector mode unless specified. Other than that, I can agree with the fact that torch staves are rather hard to obtain, but I completely disagree that torches would be easy to miss. Let's actually look at the chapters that feature Fog of War in Blazing Sword. Chapter 9. This happens during Link mode, the tutorial of the game. You can get a torch item in this very chapter before the fog even appears on screen, by walking up to the town that's right over your spawn point. In Chapter 3, the game handholds you into walking to a town to get a new character. In Chapter 6, the game doesn't guide you towards a town, but you are stuck until you get a character that you can find in one of these towns. By this point in the game has conditioned the player into thinking that town equals important. Whether it means extra character or free item, they are going to seek them out. This is the closest the game gets to giving you the item without directly adding it to your inventory. Chapter 13X. This is an optional side chapter. The only way of reaching this chapter is by the previous chapter going into the town on the top left. The town on the top left gives you a torch. You are guaranteed to have a torch. Chapter 18. Alongside the previously mentioned torch stuff, you can get a torch item by killing an enemy nomad. An enemy nomad that, while not an immediate threat, you are likely to encounter by the second turn. And if you play in normal difficulty, you can steal a torch from a pirate. In hard you can also get it by killing him. In this chapter, that also automatically joins you if you have kept alive in 16X, with a torch in his inventory. Chapter 19XX. This chapter can only be played in Hector mode, meaning that the player has already beaten the game once. They are more knowledgeable about how to maneuver around Fog of War and, by extension, more likely to have controlled uses of the torch. This chapter is also way harder to access than the other side chapters. You have to get a character to level 7 that you can only use for a maximum of 5 chapters in Link mode, which you can completely skip if you have unlocked Hector mode. And said character can only get 10 experience points per turn, with him joining at level 1 and each level up requiring 100 experience points. And defeat an optional boss who disappears if he's not defeated in one turn. It's very unlikely for a player to find this chapter by accident, so expecting more from them is far from the developers. Chapter 20. If you're playing in normal mode, a cavalier that is standing right in front of the only opening you have to access the boss has a torch that he will drop when defeated. The only chapters I'll complete that not giving you torches an actual issue are in the last 3, 22, 23, and 28. I do want to point out though that chapter 22 only becomes a Fog of War chapter if played in Hector mode and in hard difficulty, and that chapter 23 is a chapter that changes depending on the sum of the level of your 3 protagonists. The Fog of War variant only happens when the sum is lower than 50, something that, way more likely to happen to newer players, is not something that's difficult to avoid by accident as it would be to access chapter 19XX. I'd also like to point out that both torch staves and items have 5 users, the latter lasting 4 turns and is movable, and the former lasting 9 but being stationary, both with diminishing effects. It's very possible for a player to have saved up uses. Also, you could theoretically use the hammer staff to regain all of a staff's uses, but let's be real, no one is going to waste that on a torch staff.
Also, why bring this up as a piece of general advice when you acknowledge that being unable to see in Fog of War maps is still an issue regardless of the torches and visibility spells?
Because it makes it easier to navigate. If the problem with Fog of War maps is that you can't see, one could argue that being able to see more makes it less of a problem. Sure, it doesn't get rid of the problem completely, but it makes it more bearable. Putting on a jacket doesn't get rid of the cold, but it does make you feel it less. You seem to have understood that a couple seconds ago, in the part I skipped. Maybe you meant to say that this wasn't a necessary addition since it wasn't a debunk, but I don't think there's anything wrong with keep throwing in a piece of advice in a segment. Commentaries are supposed to be for giving criticism and advice after all. Even if the focus is not on the thing that socially criticize, it wouldn't necessarily be out of place. Plus, maybe Kik would have put it up way ahead of anyone else who would have pointed it out in a comment or commentary, just like I did with the fifth thing.
You know, it's really bad when even someone like me, someone who has never played a single Fire Emblem game before, can still take issue with what you said.
The Fire Emblem section of the video accounts for half the length of the commentary.
You bring up the AI being random in these levels and this whole entry falls apart, just like my attempts at making hilarious and original content. Considering this issue isn't necessarily a problem exclusive to Fog of War.
When did he say it was exactly? He said this was part of what made Fog of War levels so annoying, but he never claimed they only happened in those levels.
Ephraim, Copycat literally says that the worst part about the Fog of War levels is the AI being random, to which he then segues into talking about why that is an issue solely within these levels.
What I hated the most about these levels was the AI, as they are incredibly unpredictable. So there would be playthroughs where you need to guide someone from point A to point B, and they die before you even reach them.
Like, straight up.
That's just not what he said. Not once in this clip did Copycat say that this is a problem solely in these levels. He said that they were the worst part of these levels, but just because something is the worst part of these levels, it doesn't mean that it's a problem exclusive to these levels or that these even are bad enough to be considered problems outside of these levels. Let's view it another way. I can like a character for whatever reason, but that character can be the worst part of a show when they are executed poorly, whether it's because they are written out of character or because their flaws are exaggerated to an absurd degree. As an example, Beast Boy is one of my favorite characters of the Teen Titans. When Jeff Jones wrote for him during his run, I wanted to murder that man. Copycat says that they were unpredictable, sure. That could be just because you can't see them. so their actions look more sudden than they would be otherwise and you are less likely to be able to properly gauge your risks. Something that you yourself say during your follow-up to this segment. Also, this just hit me. He called them unpredictable. He never once called them random. I know this sounds like I'm being pedantic, but its entire conversation is based on whether or not something that is carried on throughout the game can be a reason to worsen the player's specific sections. Fire Emblem AI is not random. They have specific goals, whether it be to flee to a specific point of the map, continuously approach a target if they are nearby, or stay still. They are more specific for special occasions, but that's just a quick summary. You can check the rest on every builder if you're interested. While it is true that a player might not be able to check each enemy's AIs and it might look random at first, there's a consistency in the randomness and they are able to see how they act and respond based on that. Fire Emblem AI is predictable, even if it seems random. If it wasn't, warping out a German in the middle of a horde of enemies to get rid of them would not be a reliable strategy. But it is unpredictable during Fog of War because, again, you can see them.
From his fucking mouth. Now, copycat, I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you weren't trying to say that the AI being random is the worst part of the Fog of War levels. If you were trying to say something else, then the fault is still on you due to your wording being so poor and vague that it sounded like a completely different argument than what you were intending here.
To give another example from the Sonic series, the game Shadow the Hedgehog has a particularly infamous mission where you have to hunt down all 35 artificial chaos. The mission is very commonly considered to be the worst in the game because of the fact that you have to hunt down every single artificial chaos. Artificial chaos are just an annoying enemy, and the stage this happens in, Lost Impact, is very non-linear. Now, imagine if somebody called this the worst thing about Shadow the Hedgehog, and someone else replied by pointing out that Shadow the Hedgehog has a number of missions where you cannot miss a single target. And this isn't even the only mission in a non-linear and confusing environment. Hell, it's not even the only level to take place on the Space Colony arc. Would that somehow make the mission better?
Ephraim, your hypothetical example does not work. Since you're bringing up someone calling one specific mission in Shadow the Hedgehog the worst thing about the game towards someone calling a type of the level the worst thing about the franchise because of something every level in that franchise has.
But not to the same degree. That's the point Ephraim is trying to make. Why should it matter if the comparison is between a single game and an entire series? The comparison is meant to showcase the player's response to the same characteristic in different situations. Ephraim could have been a movie, a TV show, a book, anything really, because he was pointing out that something will not always be enjoyed in every situation regardless of how prevalent it is. This is even ignoring the fact that, as I pointed out earlier, Fire Emblem AI is random, and Copycat never called it that in any situation, Fog of War included. I actually thought of a good example for this as I was editing, and it's also Fire Emblem related. In Fire Emblem 4, there's this skill called Great Shield or Pavice, which has a character's level % chance of completely nullifying the damage of a successful hit. As in, if the character is level 5, it has a 5% chance of triggering, if it's level 10, there's a 10% chance, and so on. On your units, the skill is near useless. The only characters that can get it normally are Arden and Hannibal, both characters of the Armor Knight class. Maps in Fire Emblem 4 are very large. This means that it heavily hinders units with low movements, especially Armor Knights. They're not going to see much, if any, combat, which means that Pavice will rarely activate for you, and for Arden, it's unlikely that it will even be unlocked in the first place. Now, for enemy bosses, the skill works as intended, and it's very annoying but not the worst of the world. Now, in Chapter 2, there's a group of bandits that will destroy a village in 10 turns. If they are stopped before, you'll obtain a bargain bin, one of the best items in the game, especially useful for the aforementioned hindered lower movement units. The bandits are too far away to reach in time, and even if you could, you are stopped by an invisible wall, and since the bandits themselves are not marked as enemies, you wouldn't be able to attack them either. The only way to stop them is by seizing the nearest castle, which causes 2 characters to spawn relatively nearby, letting you kill them easily if you're fast enough. To seize the castle in question, you have to defeat 2 generals, both with the Pavice skill. In this case, you can see the same thing, going from mild annoyance to active hindrance, not by changing what the thing in question is, but by modifying the surrounding factors, like with Fog of War.
And even then, the person in your hypothetical situation could still be at fault, as if they explained it like how Copycat did with this segment, then they would be harping on this mission for the reasons you listed but would not bring up how these issues are prevalent throughout the game, instead treating it like they're solely exclusive to that level alone rather than Shadow the Hedgehog being at its worst with those issues in that stage. TRDL, your example doesn't work as a gotcha moment, try again.
Copycat's first mention of Fog of War brings up that set Fog does not allow you to predict where to go, and when he does call the AI unpredictable, he shows a clip of a character being one-shotted by someone who wasn't in view. It doesn't happen in any other levels. Maybe you could argue that he could have shown what levels look like without Fog of War, but since he described it as limited vision of the map, it's not that far off to expect an audience to imagine a map without said limited vision.
The next franchise we're going to focus on is Kirby's, where the worst thing about his series is that it's starting to become stale and repetitive. To date, there are 17 platforming games starring the titular character, with the last being Star Allies that came out for the Switch in 2018. Although there are a few interesting concepts in that game, like its multiplayer mode, during my playthrough I felt like I already had a similar experience in past titles, and it didn't seem like anything new happened at all.
Boy, I'm pretty sure Star Allies is a one-of-a-kind experience. Have you seen how ripped DD got?
Kill me!
But to be serious, how exactly do you feel that you had a similar experience in past titles when compared to one another? As the Kirby games are usually able to stand out from one another, whether it be Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, where you have an open world to explore as opposed to a hub world, Kirby Squeak Squad where you're seeking treasures, Kirby Superstars and its remake being a collection of mini adventures, or Kirby Star Allies where you are killing God with the power of friendship.
Keyblade. Mr. Master. Literally all of them, my guy. What are you saying?
I would get onto your case for the fundamental gameplay, but I would just be repeating what Ephraim was going to say that I'm skipping, so I'm not even going to bother. But what I will talk about is how you just dropped a Kirby Star Allies spoiler for a sake of a joke without any warning or heads up. This is really bad since it's essentially revealing a major plot point to anyone who hasn't played Kirby Star Allies yet, which I thought you'd be aware of considering in the Cloud Palace commentary you're in. The one before the release of your copycat video, by the way. It had you calling out user 1 Campbell for dropping a massive spoiler for Ico.
Let's talk about how you just dropped a massive spoiler for Ico without any warning or heads up, which is really bad since it's essentially revealing a major plot point to anyone who hasn't played Ico yet.
Probably because the way that Kid described that spoiler could also apply to almost every game in the Kirby series. As I said, Kirby slaying God is a recurring joke on the gaming internet. The only thing that Kid really adds to it are the power of friendship, which is just saying that you use the game's main mechanic to beat the game, and a screenshot of the boss fight where you can really only make out the character's name, in a game where story is an extremely minor factor. In contrast, Kid called what Campbell showed of Ico to be a quote-unquote massive plot point. Let's compare it to something like Mario. If I said that Bowser was the final boss of the next Mario game, would you call it a massive spoiler? I wouldn't, because it's part of the norm. Then with Kirby slaying gods. This is only a spoiler by technicality, let's be real.
Strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
Next up, we're going to look at the massively popular Pokemon franchise, where I'd have to say that the worst thing about it has to be the steady decrease in difficulty that could be seen in its newer titles. This was pretty much the main complaint of their most recent Pokemon Sword and Shield entries, as there never really was a point in the game where you felt like you were in trouble, especially as the XP share works almost too well in leveling up your entire party at once. This causes you to be several levels higher than every opponent you come across, and just makes what should at least be a bit of a challenge incredibly easy.
Okay, so shout out to Toganium for pointing this out, since I'm not too familiar with the Pokemon series, but challenge runs have become incredibly popular as of late, so I don't necessarily see the lack of difficulty point as a big deal since you could always do a challenge run such as a Nuzlocke to combat the difficulty.
This is another case of me getting your point, even agreeing to it to some extent, but just not fully feeling it, because while it is true that these kinds of runs can be a good way to make these games more difficult, shouldn't the fact that people have to go out of their way to do challenge runs make each point stronger? If for example were to be something like only using Pokemon with low stats, then I would agree, because the game's appeal comes from making your own team with the Pokemon you like. It should take situations like that into account. But with Nuzlocke, the only example you bring up, you're doing things that, what the game allows you to do, is not something that the game encourages. The series catchphrase is gotta catch 'em all, pretty hard to do and only get one encounter per room. Does it offer more difficulty? Absolutely, but by that same logic, you could also play a game with only one hand, blindfolded or while getting stabbed repeatedly, and I don't think that any of those are adequate replacements for difficulty settings.
Hulk's strongest one there is!
Self-destruct sequence initiated.
The Pikmin franchise is up next in this video, and if I have to pick one thing to complain about in the series, then that would have to be about the extremely weak portable Hey Pikmin entry that came out for the 3DS in 2017. Now, this game wasn't necessarily met with insanely negative reviews from critics and fans alike, but many noted that the 2D platforming gameplay doesn't exactly fit into what previous games had achieved. The level design quickly becomes boring, and the boss fights are so easy that they're almost laughable. This was one of the last games I remember coming out for the 3DS, and if you were like me, you probably skipped this entry as you were too busy playing your new Nintendo Switch.
So you said that if we were like you, then we'd skip the entry because we'd be busy with the Nintendo Switch, so you're essentially implying that you skipped Hey Pikmin. If you were then, why are you speaking on behalf of a game you've never played?
No, it doesn't mean he didn't play it. It would just mean that he skipped the game when it came out. After all, he called the Nintendo Switch new in the same sentence he talked about skipping it. When his video came out, the Switch would have been 4 years old. It would be at least middle-aged right now. Certainly not new by console standards. Could have just played the game way after release.
Plus, it's your video. You don't need to go off of the mediocre reviews of Hey Pikmin.
This is, again, assuming the copycat never played the game. He could very well have agreed with the common consensus and cited reviews to show that he wasn't the only one with these problems. If you want to go further, one could also interpret that the only real thing he was citing when it came to reviews was the 2D platforming of the ending of the series, with Red being his own thoughts. There is a bit after this where Nina asks Copycat to set the reviews people are referring to, which is a fun critic in my opinion, and there's nothing really wrong with anything that follows, so I'll just leave it here. My final thoughts are the following. None. Play Blade Blue.